Elijah Norton leaned back in his office chair, staring at the financial reports spread across his desk. Something wasn't adding up. Profits were steady, but turnover rates at his 11 supermarkets were climbing, and customer complaints about long checkout lines and poor service were increasing. He had built this business from the ground up, starting with a single small grocery store 20 years ago. Now he barely recognized what it had become. His district manager, Greg, had assured him everything was running smoothly, but Elijah didn't buy it. He wasn't the type of CEO to sit in an office and take reports at face value. He needed to see for himself. A plan formed in his mind. He would go undercover at one of his stores as a new trainee. The employees wouldn't recognize him. Most had only ever seen his name on memos or corporate emails. He'd blend in, get the real story, and find out what was happening on the ground. The next morning, he arrived at the store in old jeans, a plain hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had even grown out some scruff to change his normally clean-shaven look. His name tag read Illy. The store manager, a stocky man in his late 40s named Carl, barely glanced at him. "All right, Illy. You're here to learn the ropes. You'll be shadowing some of the floor workers today. Don't mess around and don't waste my time." Elijah nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He followed a young cashier, Mia, as she scanned groceries. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. "You been here long?" he asked. 2 years, she muttered, forcing a smile as she handed a customer their receipt. "Like it?" She hesitated. "It pays the bills." Elijah watched as the lines grew longer. Only 2 registers were open. "Why aren't there more cashiers?" Mia sighed. "They cut shifts. We're always short-staffed." His stomach tightened. His company prided itself on treating employees well. He had always believed in fair wages and reasonable hours, so why were shifts being cut? Later, in the break room, he overheard a conversation that made him freeze. "Please, I'll take any extra hours you've got," a young man pleaded with Carl. "I need it. I'll work nights, weekends, anything." Elijah turned. The worker, a lanky guy barely in his 20s, looked desperate. His name tag read Jason. Carl barely looked up from his clipboard. "We're staying within budget, no overtime." Jason's shoulders slumped. Not my problem," Carl interrupted. "Figure it out." Anger flared in Elijah's chest. He had always paid his employees fairly. If someone wanted to work extra hours, they should have the opportunity. But Carl had shut him down without a second thought. Jason walked away, his head down, and Elijah clenched his fists. Something was very wrong in his store, and he was going to find out exactly what. Elijah kept his head down, but his mind was racing. He had spent years building this company with the belief that his employees were treated fairly. Yet here he was, watching one of them practically beg for more hours while his manager shut him down without a second thought. If Carl was willing to dismiss Jason that easily, how many others had he turned away? As the shift continued, Elijah took on different tasks, stocking shelves, organizing displays, and helping customers find items. The more he worked, the more problems he noticed. The freezers in the back were leaking, leaving puddles on the floor. Expired products sat on shelves mixed in with fresh stock. Customers grew frustrated as they searched for employees to assist them, only to find no one available. When he asked Mia about it, she sighed. "We used to have more people on the floor, but staff cuts made it impossible to keep up. Now we're just expected to do more with less." Elijah frowned. "And Carl, what's he like as a manager?" She hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "Depends who you ask. If you're one of his favorites, he's fine. If not, good luck. He doesn't care about us, only the numbers." That was becoming painfully obvious. During his break, Elijah sat at a table in the back, eating a sandwich from the deli section. Jason was there too, scrolling through his phone while picking at a bag of chips. Elijah took a chance. "Hey man, I saw you talking to Carl earlier. You okay?" Jason exhaled sharply. "Not really, but what can I do? I've been here almost a year and they keep cutting my hours." "I'm barely making rent as it is." Elijah leaned in slightly. "Does that happen a lot?" Jason nodded. Yeah, Carl says it's about controlling payroll, but it's weird. Some people, his favorites, get all the hours they want. The rest of us, we're stuck fighting for scraps. Elijah felt his jaw tighten. That explained a lot. Carl wasn't just trimming costs, he was deciding who got to survive and who didn't. Jason shook his head. I don't get it. This place makes money, right? How hard would it be to let people work when they want to? Elijah had no good answer. Later in the day, Carl called a quick meeting in the back room. Employees crowded in, some standing against the shelves, others sitting on overturned milk crates. Carl stood in front, arms crossed. All right, listen up. Corporate's been on me about efficiency. We need to cut down on wasted time. That means no excessive breaks, no standing around, and no complaints. If you have a problem, take it somewhere else. Elijah studied the reactions. Some employees stared at the floor. Others looked annoyed but said nothing. Mia folded her arms. So when are we going to get more help? We're already stretched thin. Carl's expression darkened. You're paid to work, not to ask questions. Elijah could feel the tension in the room. Mia held Carl's gaze for a moment before shaking her head and looking away. Carl continued, if anyone doesn't like how things are run here, you know where the door is. That was the last straw. Elijah had seen enough. He wasn't just dealing with a manager who cut costs. Carl was running the store like his own personal fiefdom, disregarding both employee well-being and customer experience. By the end of his shift, Elijah knew what he had to do. It was time to reveal himself. Elijah stood near the stockroom entrance, his pulse steady as he watched Carl dismiss the concerns of his employees without hesitation. The manager's control over the store was absolute too absolute. He had seen enough. It was time to step in, not as Ali the trainee, but as Elijah Norton, the owner of the entire business Carl had been running into the ground. He walked past the shelves stacked with inventory, moving toward the front of the store where the employees were returning to their stations. Mia was back at the register, scanning groceries with the same tired efficiency. Jason had taken a position near the carts, straightening them with mechanical precision. Other employees moved with quiet resignation, each one carrying the weight of Carl's leadership. Elijah turned toward the customer service counter where Carl was speaking with another supervisor. He approached with purpose, removing his cap and straightening his posture. Carl barely glanced at him. What do you need? Elijah's voice was calm but firm. I need you to gather the staff in the break room, right now. Carl narrowed his eyes. Why would I? Elijah met his gaze evenly. Because I own this store, and I want to talk to my employees. A flicker of confusion passed over Carl's face before realization set in. His posture stiffened, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. His eyes darted toward the nearest employee, Mia, who had also stopped scanning, her hands frozen mid-motion over the register. Silence spread across the front of the store as employees picked up on what was happening. Some exchanged glances, others simply stared. Carl exhaled sharply and forced a tight-lipped nod. Fine. Within minutes, the employees were gathered in the break room. They stood in hesitant clusters, unsure of what was coming. Jason leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Mia stood near the back, her expression unreadable. Carl positioned himself near the door, arms folded across his chest. Elijah stepped forward, resting his hands against the nearest table. He let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. I started this company 20 years ago with a single store. Back then, I knew every employee's name, worked the aisles myself, and made sure we treated our people right. Somewhere along the way, I lost that connection. That's on me. A few employees exchanged looks. Others remained still. Carl's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. So I decided to come here undercover, Elijah continued. I wanted to see firsthand how things were being run. What I saw was unacceptable. Carl straightened. We've been following company policy. Elijah turned his attention to him. Is it company policy to refuse extra hours to employees who need them while giving preferential treatment to others? Is it company policy to cut shifts so much that the store can't function properly? To ignore maintenance issues, neglect customer service, and treat employees like afterthoughts. Carl's expression darkened. We have budgets to work within. Payroll constraints, Elijah shook his head. Payroll constraints don't justify treating people like this. I've always approved fair labor budgets. The problem isn't the budget, it's how you've been managing it. Mia spoke up from the back. We've been saying this for months, but nothing changed. Elijah turned toward her. That changes today. Jason's voice cut in. What happens now? Elijah let out a slow breath. Effective immediately, Carl is relieved of his position. A wave of surprise washed over the room. Some employees looked at each other as if confirming they had heard correctly. Carl's face flushed. You can't just— I can, Elijah interrupted. And I just did. Carl's mouth opened, but no words came. He turned toward the door, then back toward the employees who were now watching with something close to relief. After a tense moment, he exhaled sharply and walked out without another word. Elijah refocused on the employees. No one should have to beg for hours just to make ends meet. No one should feel like their concerns don't matter. Moving forward, we're making immediate changes. Shift availability will be reviewed, and anyone who wants more hours will have the opportunity. We'll be bringing in additional staff to make sure you're not overworked, and most importantly, we're going to listen. You all run this store every day, your voices should count. For the first time since the meeting started, a shift in the room was visible. Shoulders relaxed, expressions softened. Mia nodded. That's all we ever wanted. Jason exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I just want a fair shot. Elijah met his gaze. You'll get one, all of you will. For the first time in a long time, the store felt like it belonged to the people who worked in it. And Elijah was determined to make sure it stayed that way. Elijah stood in front of the employees, his mind already shifting from confrontation to action. The moment Carl walked out, it was as if a weight had been lifted from the room. But relief wasn't enough. He needed to make lasting changes. He turned to the group, scanning the faces in front of him. Some still looked cautious, others hopeful. The damage Carl had done wouldn't be undone in a single conversation, but this was the start. He addressed them directly. His tone was steady, purposeful. We need to rebuild trust. That starts now. First, I want to hear what's really going on. No filters, no fear of backlash. What's the biggest issue you've been dealing with? Mia didn't hesitate. We don't have enough people to do the job right. We're constantly rushed, and when something goes wrong, like a freezer breaking or a wrong shipment coming in, we're expected to just deal with it, even if it means staying late without pay. Jason added to it. Schedules are a mess. Some of us don't get enough hours, others are forced into shifts they don't want. And if you say no, you're suddenly getting even fewer shifts the next week. Another employee, a middle-aged woman named Denise, chimed in. Customers are frustrated too. They complain about long lines, empty shelves, and bad service, but we can't fix it if there aren't enough of us here. Elijah absorbed every word. He had suspected issues, but hearing them laid out so plainly made it clear just how much had been ignored under Carl's management. He nodded, making sure they saw he was taking this seriously. Here's what's going to happen. First, we're hiring more staff immediately. No more running this place on skeleton crews. Second, overtime will be approved when requested. If you want more hours, you'll get them. No favoritism, no games. A few employees exchanged glances. This was already more than they had expected. He continued. Scheduling will be fixed. We'll make sure shifts are balanced and no one will be punished for saying no to extra work. If there's ever an issue with your schedule, you'll have someone to turn to who actually listens. Jason crossed his arms, uncertainty still lingering. And who's going to make sure that actually happens? Elijah appreciated the question. Trust wasn't going to be given freely, it had to be earned. I will, but I'm also bringing in a new store manager, someone who understands that running this place means taking care of the people inside it. A murmur spread through the group. The idea of a new leader brought skepticism, but also a flicker of hope. Mia was the one to ask what they were all thinking. Who? Elijah turned to Denise. You've been here the longest. You know this store better than anyone. If you're willing, I want you to step up. Denise's eyes widened. She had spent years under Carl's leadership, always doing her job but never expecting to be noticed. She hesitated, looking around the room as if waiting for someone to object. No one did. I don't know what to say. Elijah gave her a reassuring nod. Say yes, you've earned it. A slow realization settled over her. The employees around her started nodding, a few even smiling for the first time since the meeting began. I won't let them down, she finally said. I know you won't. With that decision, a shift occurred. It wasn't just about removing Carl, it was about setting up leadership that actually cared. Elijah wasn't done yet. Denise will work with me to make sure these changes stick, and I won't be disappearing back to my office. I'll be visiting regularly, and not just this store, all of them. From now on, if something isn't working, I want to know about it before it turns into a crisis. The employees were quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then Mia spoke, her voice carrying something different this time, not just skepticism, but something closer to trust. We'll hold you to that. Elijah met her gaze. I expect you to. The meeting ended, and employees dispersed with a different energy than before. Conversations were lighter, movements less tense. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a beginning. As Elijah walked toward the front of the store, Jason caught up to him. I meant what I said earlier about just wanting a fair shot. Elijah stopped, studying him. And, Jason hesitated, then shrugged. Feels like maybe we'll finally get one. Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and handed it over. If anything starts slipping back into old habits, call me. Jason took the card, looked at it, then back at Elijah. Seriously? Seriously. With that, Elijah stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. He had come here expecting to find problems. What he had found was something more important: people who cared about the store, about their jobs, about each other. Now, it was his responsibility to make sure they never got ignored again. Elijah returned to the store 3 days later, this time as himself. No hoodie, no disguise, just the man whose name was printed on every pay stub. The automatic doors slid open, and he stepped inside to assess the changes in motion. The atmosphere felt different. It wasn't drastic, but there was less tension in the air. Employees weren't rushing as frantically between tasks. Customers weren't lingering impatiently in long lines. It was subtle, but noticeable. He spotted Denise near the produce section, clipboard in hand, speaking with a younger employee. As he approached, she glanced up, her expression shifting from concentration to recognition. She set the clipboard down and wiped her hands on her apron. I wasn't sure when you'd be back. Elijah gestured around, wanted to see how things were settling in. Denise nodded, crossing her arms. We've been making progress. The extra staff has helped. We've got 2 new hires starting this week, and I'm adjusting schedules to make sure no one's getting overworked. He studied her face, noting the way she carried herself. She wasn't hesitant like before. There was confidence in her posture now, a quiet authority. How's the team reacting? She exhaled slowly. Some are still skeptical, they've been burned before, but they're starting to believe things might actually change this time. Elijah understood. Promises were easy, results took time. He glanced toward the registers where Mia was ringing up a customer. She caught his eye briefly before returning to her work. Denise followed his gaze. She's sharp, speaks her mind, but she's got good instincts. I'm keeping an eye on her for a possible lead position. Elijah approved. She's not afraid to call things out. That's valuable. Denise hesitated. I wanted to ask you about Jason. Elijah turned back to her. He's been more engaged since you spoke with him, but I think he's looking for something more than just extra hours. He wants a real path forward. Elijah considered that. Jason had struck him as someone who wasn't just trying to get by, he was trying to get ahead. Where do you think he fits? Denise tapped the clipboard. I was thinking of training him in inventory. It's a step up from where he is now, and it'd give him more responsibility. It was a solid plan. If Jason was serious about moving forward, this would be a chance for him to prove it. Make it happen, Elijah said. Denise gave a firm nod. I'll let him know. Elijah spent the next hour walking the store, observing how things flowed. He spoke briefly with employees, checking in without making a spectacle of himself. The difference in their demeanor was evident. Some were still cautious, but there was less resignation in their expressions. Near the loading dock, he found Jason, breaking down empty boxes. The younger man wiped sweat from his forehead and looked up as Elijah approached. "You're back," Jason noted. Elijah leaned against a nearby pallet. "Told you I would be." Jason set the box cutter down. "I guess I half expected things to go back to the way they were." Elijah didn't blame him. Too many companies made surface-level changes but let old habits creep back in. "I'm not interested in temporary solutions," Elijah said. Jason watched him for a moment before nodding. "Denise said she wants to train me in inventory." Elijah crossed his arms. "How do you feel about that?" Jason shrugged. "Feels like a step up. Better than fighting for hours every week." Elijah could tell he was holding back. There was more on his mind. "What's the hesitation?" Jason hesitated before answering. "I want something more long-term, not just a few extra shifts or another title that doesn't mean anything. I want a real future here." Elijah respected the honesty. "Then take this opportunity and run with it. Show Denise you can handle more. If you prove yourself, there's room to grow." Jason considered that, then nodded. "All right." Elijah clapped him on the shoulder. "Let's see what you can do." As he left the loading dock, Elijah felt the weight of responsibility settle in a little deeper. Change wasn't just about policies, it was about people. And if he wanted to see this store thrive, he had to make sure the right people had the chance to rise.